Imagine a tent by a river, late at night, at the edge of the known world. The Danube moves through the dark beyond the camp walls, carrying cold down from mountains that have never heard of Rome and never will. The soldiers are asleep. The fires have burned to embers. Somewhere across the river, in the forests and the grasslands that stretch north beyond everything the Empire has managed to organize and name, there are people who want to destroy what he is responsible for protecting. He is not thinking about them right now. He is writing, not orders, not dispatches, not the administrative correspondence that follows him even here, to the frontier, because an empire does not pause for the convenience of the man running it. He is writing something else entirely, something private, something that was never meant for anyone else to read. He is writing to himself, reminding himself to be patient, to be honest, to remember that power is a temporary arrangement and that the only thing actually worth building in the time he has been given is character. His name is Marcus Aurelius. He is one of the most powerful men of the ancient world, and the most important work he ever did, the work that outlasted the empire, the wars, the plague, and everything else the world threw at him, was done alone, in the dark, in a notebook no one was supposed to find. This is his story. Settle in. Let the noise of your day fall away. Tonight we travel back nearly 2,000 years, to one of the greatest empires the world had ever known, to the marble corridors and the dusty frontier camps of ancient Rome, to the life of a man who was handed everything and found meaning not in what he was given, but in how he chose to carry it. You do not need to know Roman history to follow this story. You do not need to know philosophy. All you need is a quiet room and a willingness to listen. Close your eyes if you like. We begin at the beginning. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Was Chosen. Imagine a house on a hill in Rome. Sometime in the early 2nd century, a boy is reading by lamplight in a room that has gone quiet while the city outside has not. Through the walls comes the low roar of 1 million people living in close proximity. The carts and the arguments and the particular restless energy of a civilization that has decided it is the final form of human organization. Inside this room, a boy who will one day carry the weight of all of it is sitting very still, working through a text his tutor assigned, asking the margins questions the tutor did not think to ask. He is already, at whatever age this imagined moment places him, the kind of child who makes adults feel that he is paying more attention than they are. His name is Marcus Annius Verus. He was born on the 26th of April in the year 121 to a family of Spanish origin that had, over 2 generations, risen to a position of quiet but genuine importance in Roman public life. His father was Marcus Annius Verus, a man of praetorian rank. His mother was Domitia Lucilla, a woman of considerable inherited wealth, educated and serious, possessed of a moral clarity that her son would carry for the rest of his life long after she was gone. His father died when Marcus was very young, before the boy was old enough to carry a clear memory of him. He was perhaps 2 or 3 years old. The loss was real, but the shape of his childhood was not defined by absence so much as by what stepped in to fill it. His grandfather, also named Marcus Annius Verus, also a man of immense social standing, 3 times consul, a figure whose reputation in Rome was built on something that was not always common in the circles where he moved. He was known for being genuinely good, not merely successful, not merely politically skilled, good, honest in his dealings, consistent in his character, respected by people who had no reason to flatter him. Marcus would later write about his grandfather with a specificity that tells you the memory was real and not ceremonial. He credited him with teaching him to be gentle, to be meek, and to refrain from all anger and passion. That is not the language of a man describing an abstract influence. That is the language of someone who watched a specific person live a specific way and decided, early and quietly, that this was worth imitating. His mother raised him with the kind of deliberate attention that only becomes visible in retrospect. When the person being raised turns out to have been shaped by it in ways that last a lifetime. She kept him away from the standard boarding schools of the Roman elite. She educated him at home, with private tutors, in an environment that was smaller and more careful than the rough social world that most children of his class passed through. Marcus would later credit her with teaching him simplicity of diet, and to be far removed from the ways of the rich. Pause here for a moment. Here is a child born into genuine wealth, raised in one of the most powerful cities in the world, in a family with direct access to the highest levels of Roman society, and the lesson his mother taught him, the lesson he remembered and recorded decades later when he was emperor of that same world, was not about power or status or the art of advancement. It was about not needing more than you actually need. That lesson did not come from philosophy. It came from a woman in a house in Rome, making choices about how to raise her son, long before anyone outside that house had any reason to care who he was going to become. Picture that boy again, growing up between the steady presence of his grandfather and the deliberate care of his mother, learning to read people the way his grandfather read situations, learning to live simply the way his mother lived, developing, without knowing it, the interior habits that would one day be the only thing standing between him and the corruption that absolute power tends to produce. He studied Greek, the language in which the most important ideas of the ancient world had been recorded and were still being debated. He studied rhetoric, the art of constructing and delivering arguments, which, in Rome, was not an academic exercise, but a practical skill as essential to public life as military training was to a soldier. He studied the foundational texts of a civilization that believed, with considerable justification, that it had produced the best of what human organization could achieve. He was, by the accounts that survive, a serious child, not joyless. Ancient sources describe him as having genuine warmth, a capacity for affection, a quality of attention in personal relationships that people remembered long afterward, but serious in the sense that matters, which is that he did not treat the world as a performance. He was interested in it. He wanted to understand it. There is a story, preserved in sources that historians treat with appropriate caution about their specific details, but that often reflect genuine tradition in their spirit, that when Marcus was around 12 years old, he began dressing in the rough cloak of a philosopher and sleeping on a simple board rather than a comfortable bed, adopting physical practices of austerity before he had any formal education in why austerity might matter. Whether every detail is precisely accurate cannot be verified across the distance of nearly 2,000 years. What it points to is something real, which is that something in him was drawn toward simplicity and toward the life of the mind before the world had given him any particular reason to pursue either. He was not running away from comfort. He was already suspicious of it. And then something happened that changed the trajectory of his life entirely. Though it did not feel like change to him at the time, it felt, if the later evidence is any guide, like an imposition. The Emperor Hadrian noticed him. Hadrian was one of the remarkable rulers of Rome, a man of genuine intellectual curiosity and enormous political skill, who had spent his reign travelling the empire he governed, inspecting its edges and its institutions with a personal attention that most rulers delegated entirely to subordinates. He was also a man who thought carefully about succession, because he understood that the answer to that question was more important than almost anything else he could arrange. He had no biological children. He was watching. Marcus caught his attention for reasons that ancient sources describe variously, but that seemed to converge on a quality that was unusual enough to be noticeable even in a city full of talented children of ambitious families. Ancient accounts, including the Historia Augusta, which historians always read with appropriate critical caution, record that the boy was genuinely honest, not performing honesty in the way that children with social intelligence learn to perform it for adults in authority. Actually honest, in a way that was visible precisely because it was not calibrated for effect. Hadrian, who had spent decades around people who told him what he wanted to hear, apparently found this striking. Those same ancient sources record that he gave the boy a nickname, Verissimus, a Latin superlative meaning most truthful or most genuine. It was an affectionate name, the kind you give a child you have decided to find charming. But it was also a name that tells you something about what the emperor saw and valued in the boy standing in front of him. This moment, this noticing, was the first link in a chain that would eventually place Marcus Aurelius on the throne of Rome. Not because Hadrian immediately decided to make him emperor. The distance between a powerful man noticing a promising child and that child eventually ruling the world is long and complicated and passes through several other decisions made by several other people over several decades. But it began here, with an emperor looking at a boy and seeing something worth remembering. Marcus was perhaps 10 years old. He had no way of knowing what being noticed by this particular man would eventually mean. He went back to his studies, to his grandfather's house, to the quiet domestic world that his mother had built around him with such deliberate care. But the world had registered his existence. And the world, once it decides it has a use for you, is not easily put off. There is something worth sitting with in this earliest chapter of his life. Something that becomes clearer the further you follow his story. Marcus Aurelius did not seek the life that was coming for him. He did not maneuver for it, or perform for it, or shape himself to fit the expectations of people who might be useful to him later. He was simply himself, as clearly and consistently as a child can be, and the world came to find him rather than the other way around. Whether that is fortunate or tragic is a question his own writings suggest he spent considerable time with. He never arrived at a simple answer. Neither, perhaps, should we. The boy from the house on the hill would grow up. He would study. He would be handed obligations he did not choose and taught to carry them as though the carrying itself were the point. He would become, in time, something that Rome had rarely seen and has not seen since. But that is the story ahead. For now, a boy with an honest face and a serious mind is growing up in his grandfather's house, reading by lamplight, asking questions, that do not have easy answers. He is not yet the emperor. He is just Marcus. And that, it turns out, is where everything begins. Chapter 2. The Teacher Who Changed Everything. There is a moment in most lives when a single encounter reorganizes everything that came before it. Not always a dramatic moment. Not always something that announces itself as significant. Sometimes it is a book left on a table by someone who thought nothing of it. Sometimes it is a sentence that lands differently than the person who spoke it intended. Sometimes it is the quiet collision between a mind that has been waiting without knowing it was waiting, and an idea that fits that mind so precisely that the recognition feels less like discovery and more like remembering something you always knew. For Marcus Aurelius, that moment came through a book. He was around 12 years old, still living in the careful world his mother and grandfather had built around him, still moving through the standard curriculum of a Roman boy of his class. And then someone placed in his hands a text by a man named Epictetus. Epictetus was not a Roman aristocrat. He was not a senator or a general or a man of inherited position. He had been a slave, and he had spent the years of his captivity doing something that no master and no circumstance could prevent. He had been thinking, carefully, rigorously, and with the particular intensity of someone who has been stripped of everything external and has therefore been forced to ask what, if anything, remains. What remained, Epictetus concluded, was the one thing that no master could touch, the capacity to choose how you respond to what happens to you. This was not a comforting philosophy in the sense of telling you that things would be fine. It was a demanding philosophy. It asked you to look clearly at the distinction between what is in your control and what is not, to invest your energy and your identity entirely in the former, and to practice a disciplined indifference toward the latter, not the indifference of someone who does not care, the indifference of someone who has decided, deliberately and with full understanding of what the decision costs, not to let the uncontrollable determine the shape of their inner life. The tradition passed down about Epictetus includes a story, preserved in sources of varying reliability, that his master once twisted his leg as a demonstration of power, and Epictetus said calmly that the leg would break. It broke. He was eventually freed, set up a small school in Nicopolis, in what is now northwestern Greece, and spent the rest of his life teaching. He wrote nothing himself. What survived came through a student named Arrian, who recorded his teacher's lectures in a work called the Discourses, and distilled their essence into a shorter text called the Enchiridion, meaning handbook in Greek. These were the texts that reached Marcus, and the effect was not the effect of reading something interesting. It was the effect of recognition, the simplicity his mother had taught him, the honest character his grandfather had modelled, the early instinctive suspicion of luxury and comfort. These were not random qualities he happened to have. They were, Epictetus told him, the beginning of something, the beginning of a life organized around what actually matters rather than what merely appears to matter. He did not run off to a philosopher's school or reject the path his family's position had laid out for him. He was too serious for gestures, and too honest to mistake the gesture for the thing itself. But something shifted in how he understood what he was doing and why. The studies that had been preparation for a life of Roman public service became, alongside that, preparation for something harder to name and more important to him personally. He was learning how to live. Then came Junius Rusticus. Rusticus arrived in Marcus's life when Marcus was in his 20s, already occupying significant public positions by virtue of his family's connections and the Emperor Hadrian's attention. Rusticus was a Stoic philosopher and a man of practical affairs, which in Rome were not considered contradictory. He had served in public roles and understood the world Marcus was navigating. He also understood Stoic philosophy with a depth and seriousness that went beyond the fashionable interest in Greek thought that characterized much of the Roman elite. He gave Marcus a personal copy of the discourses of Epictetus. This was not simply a gift. It was an act of intellectual introduction. One serious person saying to another that this is worth your full attention, and Marcus, who had encountered Epictetan ideas in boyhood but now had the maturity to engage with them at greater depth, gave it his full attention. In the Meditations, written decades later, Marcus lists Rusticus among the people to whom he owes the most, and the specific debts he names are revealing. From Rusticus, he says, "He learned to read carefully, and not be satisfied with a general overview, to not be misled by sophistical cleverness, to write without ornament." That last one matters. To write without ornament. In a culture where rhetorical display was a primary form of social currency, where the ability to speak beautifully was the mark of an educated man, Marcus was being taught, and choosing to learn. That clarity mattered more than brilliance. That the point of words was to say something true, not to demonstrate the sophistication of the person saying it. This lesson shows up on every page of the Meditations. But Rusticus gave him something beyond technique. He gave him permission. If permission is the right word for what a serious teacher gives a serious student, to take the inner life as seriously as the public life, to understand that the work happening inside a person, the daily effort to think clearly and act honestly, and keep the self from being corrupted by circumstance, was not a retreat from responsibility, but the foundation of it. For Marcus, standing at the edge of a life that was going to place enormous external demands on him, this was not an abstract lesson. It was a practical map for surviving what was coming. He had other teachers too. Apollonius of Chalcedon, whom Marcus credits with teaching him freedom of will and constancy of purpose. Sextus of Hierona, who showed him what a life governed by natural principles actually looked like in practice, lived out in real time rather than merely described in texts. These men did not give Marcus his character. His character was already there, shaped by his mother and his grandfather, and whatever combination of temperament and early experience had made him the kind of child who slept on a hard board because softness seemed suspicious. What they gave him was a vocabulary for it, a tradition to stand inside, a set of practices and principles that had been tested by others before him and that he could test himself, in the specific conditions of his specific life. And his specific life was about to become conditions that no Stoic philosopher had ever faced in quite the same form, because the life coming for Marcus Aurelius was not going to be a philosopher's life. It was going to be something far more complicated than that. Chapter 3. A Reluctant Prince. In the year 138, the Emperor Hadrian was dying. He had ruled Rome for 21 years. He had travelled its provinces, reformed its administration, and built monuments that still carry his name across 2,000 years. He was 62 years old, ill with what ancient sources describe as heart failure, and he was doing what emperors who think carefully must eventually do. He was deciding who came next. The question of succession in Rome was never simple. The empire had no fixed hereditary rule. Emperors could adopt heirs, nominate successors, make arrangements of extraordinary complexity, and still watch everything collapse in the wrong hands. Hadrian had already suffered one failed succession. His first chosen heir, a man named Lucius Saeonius Commodus, had died of a lung hemorrhage in early 138 before the arrangements could be completed. Hadrian had mourned him and then turned his attention back to the problem with the urgency of a man who knows he is running out of time. He chose a senator named Antoninus, a man of distinguished family and unimpeachable reputation, to be his heir. But Hadrian attached a condition. Antoninus would adopt 2 young men as his own sons and designated successors. One was the son of Hadrian's first failed choice. The other was Marcus Annius Verus, the boy from the hill in Rome, the child Hadrian had noticed and nicknamed Verissimus years earlier. Marcus was 17 years old. He had not been consulted. He was being moved, with the confidence of a man who has the authority to move people, into a position that would define the rest of his life. His reaction, as best as the evidence allows us to reconstruct it, was not enthusiasm. Marcus would later write, in passages from the Meditations that scholars read as autobiographical, about the importance of not being transformed by the imperial purple, of keeping the self intact against the pressure of power and its surrounding apparatus. He wrote this as a warning to himself, which means it was a warning against a transformation he considered genuinely possible, perhaps even likely. It is not the writing of a man who had always wanted what he now had. When Hadrian died later that year, Antoninus became emperor. Marcus became Caesar, heir apparent, brought into the mechanisms of imperial governance as a student and as a symbol of continuity. He asked if he could stay in his mother's house. This detail, preserved in the Historia Augusta with all the caution that source requires, is the kind of detail that feels true in its spirit, even where the precise words cannot be verified. The new Caesar, heir to one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen, wanted to remain in the private home where he had grown up rather than move into the imperial palace. Think about what that request reveals. He had just been handed the future of Rome, and his first instinct was to go home, not to the palace, not to the centre of power, not toward the thing that most ambitious men of his era would have spent their entire lives manoeuvring to reach. Home, to his mother's house, to the quiet rooms where he had grown up reading philosophy and learning from his grandfather what a good man actually looks like. Antoninus allowed it, at least for a time. Marcus continued to live simply, to eat simply, to keep the habits of mind and body that he had been developing since childhood. The world was pulling him in one direction. He was pulling, quietly and without drama, toward something else. He married Faustina, Antoninus's own daughter, in the year 145. When he was in his mid-20s, he would remain married to her for nearly 30 years, but that is a story for a later chapter. The period between 138 and 161 is the longest waiting period in Roman imperial history, 23 years as Caesar, 23 years in which the throne was occupied by someone else, and Marcus was in the unusual position of being both fully inside the machinery of power and not yet fully responsible for it. He used this time in a way that tells you everything about the man he was becoming. He did not maneuver. He did not build factions or position himself to take power sooner than circumstance intended to give it to him. He governed in the capacities he was given. He served as consul twice. He participated in the Senate. He handled legal cases with a seriousness and a care for the individuals in front of him that people who appeared before him apparently remembered long afterward. And then he went home and read philosophy. The letters that survive between Marcus and his rhetoric teacher Marcus Cornelius Fronto, written during these years, give us something rare. A direct window into what Marcus was actually like as a young man before the full weight of the role descended on him. Fronto was one of the most celebrated orators of his age, and he clearly adored his student with the particular warmth of a teacher who has found someone genuinely worth teaching. The letters are sometimes formal, as correspondence of the period tended to be, but they are also sometimes surprisingly warm, full of affectionate humour and real mutual regard. Fronto teases Marcus about his philosophical obsessions. Marcus defends philosophy with good humour, and then turns around and acknowledges that Fronto has a point about the practical value of rhetoric. There is a quality of genuine friendship in these letters, uncalculated and alive in a way that official documents never are. But there is also, running underneath the warmth, a growing divergence. Fronto wanted to make Marcus into the greatest orator Rome had produced. He believed, with the conviction of a man who had built his life on a particular set of skills, that the ability to speak beautifully and argue persuasively was the highest achievement available to a public man. Marcus was becoming convinced that something else mattered more. He was being pulled, year by year, further into Stoic philosophy and further away from the rhetorical performance that Fronto represented. He was beginning to write in a style that was spare and direct, and almost entirely stripped of the ornamental flourishes that Roman culture rewarded. He was prioritizing the interior question. What kind of person am I becoming? Over the exterior question, how am I being perceived? This was not a rejection of Fronto, whom he genuinely loved. It was a growing clarity about what Marcus actually valued, arriving slowly and honestly through years of reading and practice and the daily friction of living inside obligations he had not chosen. Antoninus Pius governed with a steadiness that made his reign feel peaceful to those living through it. He governed without major wars, without serious domestic crises, without the kind of instability that tends to generate historical drama. Marcus watched him for 23 years. He was watching carefully. He later wrote that he learned from Antoninus to be constant and imperturbable, to be careful rather than theatrical in the management of public affairs, and to understand that the dignity of a ruler comes from what he does rather than how he appears while doing it. This is the language of someone who had watched a man govern for 2 decades and had been taking notes the entire time. The waiting was not empty. It was, in a way, Marcus could not have designed if he had tried. The ideal preparation for what was coming. He had time to think, to read, to develop the philosophical practice that would become the framework through which he interpreted everything the empire would later throw at him. He had time to be a person, with ordinary human relationships and ordinary human concerns, before the role of emperor consumed all the available space. He did not know, of course, that this is what he was doing. He was just living his life, not knowing which parts would turn out to matter and which would be forgotten. But by the year 161, When Antoninus felt death approaching and summoned Marcus to give him the golden statue of fortune that was the traditional symbol of imperial authority, Marcus Aurelius was not an untested man. He was someone who had spent 40 years becoming, as quietly and as honestly as the world would allow, exactly who he was. The statue passed from one pair of hands to another. The waiting was over, and the hardest part was just beginning. Chapter 4. The Weight of the Purple. Antoninus Pius died on the 7th of March in the year 161. He died the way he had lived. Without drama and without spectacle, ancient sources record that in his final hours he called his officers together, gave the watchword for the night as equanimity, and then turned over as if to sleep. He was 74 years old. He had ruled Rome for nearly 23 years. He left behind an empire that was, by the standards of what empires tend to do to themselves, in reasonably good order. He also left behind a man who was now, whether he wanted it or not, responsible for all of it. Marcus was 40 years old. The preparation had been real. The moment was still extraordinary in its weight. And what happened in the first hours of his reign tells you more about Marcus Aurelius than almost anything else the historical record preserves. The Senate convened to confirm his succession. The confirmation was not in doubt. Marcus was the designated heir of a beloved emperor. He was going to be emperor. That was settled before anyone sat down. Marcus stood before the Senate and made a request that no one had expected. He asked them to make Lucius Verus his co-emperor. Lucius Verus was the other young man Hadrian had arranged for Antoninus to adopt. He was 30 years old, nearly a decade younger than Marcus. He was charming and handsome and sociable in ways that Marcus was not, fond of entertainment and the pleasures that imperial wealth made available in extraordinary abundance. He was not, by most assessments, ancient or modern, a man of deep philosophical seriousness. Marcus insisted on sharing power with him anyway. The Senate agreed, because the Senate was not in a position to refuse. Lucius Verus became co-emperor. For the first time in Roman history, the empire had two rulers simultaneously, each with the full title and the full formal authority. Why did Marcus do this? The sources do not give us a single clean answer, and historians have offered several interpretations. Frank McLynn, in his biography of Marcus, published in 2009, suggests that Marcus understood the practical military value of having Lucius available to command campaigns in the East, since Marcus himself had no military experience, and the empire's eastern frontier was already showing signs of instability. Anthony Birley, in his biography published in 1987, points to Marcus's genuine sense of loyalty to what Hadrian had originally intended, which had always implied a role for both young men. But there is something else in the decision that purely strategic explanation does not fully capture. Marcus had spent 40 years becoming someone deeply suspicious of power and what it does to the person who holds it. He had been reading Epictetus and the Stoic tradition for nearly 30 years, a tradition that treated the appetite for dominance as one of the primary corruptions of human character. And now he was sitting at the absolute centre of the most powerful institution in the Western world, with every mechanism of that institution designed to concentrate authority in a single pair of hands. He gave half of it away before the day was over. Whether this was wisdom or an expression of philosophical principle that did not fully account for the practical complications of divided authority is a question worth sitting with. What is clear is that no one had required it of him. He could have taken everything. He decided that taking everything was not the right thing to do. The early months of his reign were consumed by the work of taking over the governance of an enormous and complex institution. Marcus threw himself into it with a thoroughness that ancient sources consistently note. He took the legal responsibilities of the emperor with particular seriousness, spending long hours hearing cases and giving judgments that people found remarkable for their care. He was not performing justice. He was trying to deliver it, case by case, in the specific and concrete situations of specific and concrete human lives. He reformed several aspects of the legal treatment of slaves and of children, making it harder for masters and fathers to exercise absolute authority in ways that caused serious harm. These were not dramatic revolutions. They were careful, incremental adjustments to a system he could not remake entirely, and that he was trying to make slightly less brutal at its edges. He continued his philosophical practice throughout. The Meditations show no discontinuity between the man who was studying under Rusticus and the man who was now governing the empire. He is asking himself the same questions. He is applying the same standards. The throne has not reorganized his inner life. He wrote to himself, in one of the passages that scholars believe dates from the early years of his reign, a reminder to keep himself from being stained by imperial court life. Not court life in the abstract, but the specific texture of it, the flattery, the deference, the constant presence of people whose livelihoods depended on pleasing him, the subtle daily pressure to believe that he was more than a man doing a difficult job in difficult circumstances. He had to keep reminding himself that he was not. That reminding, repeated throughout the years of the Meditations, is one of the most honest things any powerful person has ever written about what power feels like from the inside. He wrote about himself the way a doctor writes about a patient whose condition requires constant monitoring, not with contempt, but without illusion. He saw himself clearly, or tried to. He recorded his failures to live up to his own standards with the same directness he brought to everything else. He was not building a monument. He was trying to stay honest in a situation that made honesty extremely difficult. Lucius Verus threw himself into imperial life in an entirely different way. He enjoyed the theatre, the gladiatorial games, the elaborate social world of a man who had been given resources beyond imagining and intended to use them. He was not wicked in any systematic sense. He was simply someone for whom pleasure was the primary organizing principle, which in a private citizen would be unremarkable, and in a co-emperor was a recurring complication. Marcus managed this with a patience that the sources describe as genuine rather than performed. He covered for Lucius when covering was necessary. He did not publicly criticize him or maneuver against him. He held the arrangement together through the discipline of simply refusing to let it fall apart. And then, before the first year of his reign was complete, the world stopped cooperating with the careful, measured governance he was trying to practice. The East erupted. The Parthian Empire launched an invasion of the Roman province of Armenia in the year 161. A Roman army met them in Cappadocia, in what is now central Turkey, and was destroyed. The governor of Syria, one of the most senior Roman commanders in the region, died in the disaster, under circumstances that ancient sources describe with a diplomatic vagueness suggesting the defeat was sufficiently humiliating that the details were better left imprecise. Rome had not suffered a military catastrophe of this kind in decades, and Marcus, who had spent his entire adult life among books and legal cases and philosophical conversations, found himself standing at the centre of it. He had studied governance. He had watched Antoninus manage crises from a distance. He had read histories of great commanders and their campaigns. But reading about war and being responsible for one are two entirely different things. And in those early days of the crisis, the gap between the Emperor Marcus was supposed to be and the man Marcus actually was must have felt very wide indeed. He did what he had always done when the gap appeared. He worked. He sent Lucius Verus east to command the campaign. The actual military work was done by professional commanders, particularly a general named Avidius Cassius, whose abilities were considerable and whose personality would become significant later. The Eastern campaign went well. Eventually, by 166, Roman forces had pushed deep into Parthian territory and forced terms that restored Roman prestige. Lucius returned to Rome. There was a triumph. The city celebrated. Marcus organized the celebrations with the careful attention to ceremony that the moment required. He stood in the procession and accepted the formal honors. Then he went home and wrote in his notebook about the importance of not being impressed by victories. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he was actively working to prevent himself from enjoying it too much. The triumph felt like an ending. It was not an ending. It was the beginning of the hardest years any Roman emperor had faced in living memory. Chapter 5. Plague, War, and the Danube. The soldiers came home from the east in the year 166, and they brought something with them that no general had ordered and no treaty had anticipated. They brought a disease, what ancient sources called the Antonine Plague, named for the dynasty Marcus belonged to, spread outward from the returning armies along the same roads that had made Rome great. It moved through the extraordinary network of paved highways that connected every corner of the empire to every other corner, carried in the bodies of people who did not yet know they were carrying it, moving toward cities and farms and military camps that had no preparation for what was coming. The Greek physician Galen was practicing medicine in Rome during these years, and his writings are among the most important sources we have for what the plague actually looked like. He described fever and inflammation of the throat. He described a skin eruption appearing around the 9th day of illness. He described severe diarrhea and high mortality among those infected. Underneath his clinical descriptions, if you read carefully, you find something harder to quantify: the social disruption, the overwhelmed households, the inadequate burial arrangements, the particular panic of a civilization that had believed its organization and its medicine were equal to most challenges, discovering that they were not equal to this one. How many people died? This is a question the historical evidence cannot answer with the precision that people understandably want. Modern historians, working from fragmentary ancient sources and what can be inferred from documentary and archaeological records, have proposed various estimates, with some scholars suggesting figures in a range of 5 to 10 million dead across the empire over the active decades of the plague. Other historians argue that the surviving evidence does not support estimates that specific, and that the true toll, while clearly enormous, cannot be reliably pinned down to particular numbers. What is not disputed is that the scale was catastrophic. Entire communities were devastated. The military and agricultural and administrative fabric of the empire was damaged in ways that took generations to repair. Marcus governed through all of it. He organized relief. He arranged for the burial of the dead in cities where mortality had overwhelmed normal civic processes. He managed the supply of grain to communities whose agricultural labor had been depleted by the disease. He tried, with the instruments available to a Roman emperor in the 2nd century, to keep the machinery of civilization running while the machinery of death worked alongside it. He also lost people he loved. The plague did not spare the imperial family. Children died. And the grief in the Meditations from these years is not philosophical abstraction. It is human, worked into philosophical form by a man trying to use every tool available to him to keep functioning under losses that were both public and deeply personal. He kept functioning, and then, just as the Eastern campaign was winding down, and the plague was still burning through the provinces, the northern frontier broke. Germanic and Sarmatian tribes living beyond the Danube had been watching the empire absorb the shock of the Eastern campaign and the plague. They had their own pressures. Migrations of peoples further east, creating a cascade of movement that eventually translated into military force on Rome's borders. In the year 167, a coalition of Germanic tribes crossed the Danube, broke through Roman defences, and pushed into the Italian peninsula itself. This had not happened in nearly 300 years. The psychological shock in Rome was immense. The Italian peninsula was supposed to be the heart of the empire, protected by the frontier provinces and the legions stationed there. That Germanic warriors had crossed the Alps and were operating on Italian soil was not merely a military problem. It was a statement about the condition of Roman power that the Senate and the streets of Rome could not easily absorb. Marcus absorbed it and moved. Before he left Rome, he did something the ancient sources preserve as significant, and that tells you a great deal about how he understood his responsibilities. He raised money for the campaign not by extracting new taxes from provinces already strained by the plague and its economic disruption, but by selling objects from the imperial collection: statues, furniture, gold vessels, clothing, items accumulated in the palace over generations. He put them on the auction block in Trajan's Forum. The action of someone who understood that the resources of the office were held in trust, not owned. He and Lucius Verus left for the northern frontier in 168. Lucius died on the return journey in 169. He was struck by what the sources describe as apoplexy, almost certainly a stroke or hemorrhage. He died in a carriage on a road in northeastern Italy, 39 years old. Marcus accompanied the body back to Rome, oversaw the funeral rites and the Senate's formal deification of his co-emperor, and then turned around and went back to the frontier. He was on his own now. He would remain on his own for the rest of his reign. The wars that followed, which historians call the Marcomannic Wars, were not a single conflict with a clear beginning and a decisive end. They were a grinding, decade-and-a-half-long effort to stabilize a frontier that kept destabilizing, to push back tribes that kept returning, to manage a military and diplomatic situation of enormous complexity across hundreds of miles of the Danube and into the territories beyond. There was a crisis within the crisis that tested Marcus more than the plague or the Germanic tribes. In the year 175, a report reached him that stopped everything. Avidius Cassius, the general who had commanded the successful Eastern campaign a decade earlier, had declared himself emperor. The report said that Marcus was dead. Whether this was a rumour Cassius had spread himself, or a genuine misunderstanding he had decided to act on, or something more deliberately orchestrated, the ancient sources do not resolve clearly, and modern historians continue to debate. What is clear is that Cassius had the loyalty of the Eastern legions, the wealth of the Eastern provinces, and the military reputation to make his challenge genuinely dangerous. Marcus moved to deal with it. But before he could reach Cassius, the revolt collapsed. Cassius was killed by his own officers. His head was sent to Marcus. Marcus refused to look at it. He arranged for Cassius's family to be treated with clemency. He asked the Senate not to execute Cassius's supporters. He could have used the revolt as an opportunity to punish, to make examples, to demonstrate what happened to those who challenged him. He chose to be merciful, not because mercy was the politically clever move, though it may have been, because it was consistent with everything he actually believed about how a human being should behave toward other human beings, even those who had done him serious harm. The campaigns resumed. The empire held, and Marcus, in his tent by the Danube, kept writing, not about victories, not about strategy or power or the drama of what was happening around him, about patience, about honesty, about the effort to remain, under all of it, the person he was trying to be. Chapter 6. What he wrote in the dark. There is a book that should not exist, not because its ideas are dangerous, though some of them are uncomfortable in the way that honest things tend to be, not because it was suppressed or hidden or nearly destroyed, though its survival across nearly 18 centuries involved enough fortune to make you aware of how many things we almost lost. It should not exist because it was never meant to be a book at all. The work we call the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius was written by a man who had no intention of anyone ever reading it. This is not a metaphor or a romantic exaggeration. It is the most important single fact about the text, the fact that changes everything else about how you read it and what you take from it. Marcus was not writing for an audience. He was not composing a philosophical treatise to be circulated among educated Romans. He was not building an argument to be debated in the schools. He was not constructing a monument to his own wisdom for the admiration of posterity. He was writing notes to himself, the way a person writes in a private journal at the end of a difficult day, using the act of writing to clarify what he actually thought, to hold himself to the standards he was trying to live by. The original Greek title, to the extent that there was one, appears to have been something like ta eis hioton, which translates roughly as things to oneself, or notes to himself. This is a very different title from Meditations, which suggests a formal philosophical practice, a composed and deliberate reflection. The original title is more honest. It is the title of something private, something not meant to leave the room. How it survived is something we cannot reconstruct with complete certainty. Marcus died in 180, and the text appears to have been preserved, possibly by members of his household or the imperial library. Through the chaotic centuries that followed, it was known to some later writers in antiquity, preserved in Byzantine manuscript collections, and reached the modern world through a manuscript tradition whose exact path is not entirely clear. The scholar and translator Gregory Hays, whose modern English version, published in 2002, is widely considered among the most readable and accurate available. Notes that the text shows signs of being a working document, with repetitions and variations that suggest different writing sessions rather than a polished final composition. Marcus was not polishing. He was working. Most scholars believe the bulk of the text was written during the campaign years on the northern frontier, in the military camps along the Danube, over roughly the final decade or so of his life. The notation of specific military locations in some of the books is consistent with this. Though scholars continue to examine and debate the precise dating of individual passages, now think about what it means to write philosophy in a military tent, at the edge of a war, after a day of decisions that affected millions of people. You are not writing with the leisure of someone in a comfortable study who can arrange their thoughts carefully and revise them at their ease. You are writing in whatever time the day leaves, with the weight of the day still on you, using the act of writing to put something back in order that the day has disordered. Imagine him sitting with his notebook after a day like that. The fire burning low in the corner of the tent, the sounds of the camp settling into night around him, the river moving somewhere in the dark beyond the walls, and in his hand, a stylus. On the page, not a report of what happened, not a plan for tomorrow, but a question: was I the person I am trying to be today? That is what the Meditations actually are, and once you understand this, the text changes. What does it say? The distinction between what is in our control and what is not is the foundation of everything else. Marcus returns to this distinction more than to any other single idea. The external world, other people's behavior, the outcomes of events, the body's health, the judgments of history, none of these are in our control. What is in our control is the quality of our own responses, the honesty of our own thinking, the character of our own actions. This is not a counsel of passivity. Marcus was governing an empire, fighting wars, managing crises. He was anything but passive. It is a counsel of clarity about where the real work happens and where the real stakes are. He writes about the present moment with an emphasis worth pausing on. He writes repeatedly about the importance of being fully in the situation you are actually in, rather than anticipating future catastrophes or dwelling on past injuries. This is not a simple instruction to be cheerful. It is a philosophical position rooted in the understanding that the only moment in which anything can actually be done is the moment you currently occupy, and that fragmenting your attention across time is a form of self-abandonment. He writes about death with a frequency that some readers find unsettling and others find liberating. Death is natural. Death is not evil. The Meditations return to mortality, not to dwell in it morbidly, but to use it as a clarifying lens. If you know that everything is temporary, including you, it becomes easier to see what actually matters and harder to be distracted by what does not. He writes about other people with a combination of clear-eyed realism and deliberate compassion that is one of the most humanly recognizable things in the entire text. He acknowledges that people are often foolish, often selfish, often frustrating in ways that are difficult to excuse, and then he reminds himself, with a patience that was clearly effortful rather than natural, that this is what people are like, that they act from their own limited understanding just as he acts from his, and that anger at them for being what they are is as senseless as anger at weather. He writes, in one of the passages that has been read by people in difficulty for nearly 2,000 years, that when you wake in the morning you should tell yourself that you will meet today with people who are meddling ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and unsociable. They are this way because they do not know the difference between good and bad. But you, who have seen the nature of good and bad, cannot be harmed by any of them. He wrote this to himself before getting out of bed in the morning. He wrote it because he needed to hear it. Can you feel how different that is from a lecture? This is the quality of the Meditations that makes it different from almost any philosophical text that survived from the ancient world. It is philosophy as it is actually practiced, not as it is taught. It shows the gap between knowing what is right and doing what is right, the friction of daily effort, the need to remind yourself of things you already understand, because understanding is not the same as living. The Stoic tradition before Marcus had produced great systematic thinkers. Zeno of Citium had founded the school in Athens around 300 BC. Seneca had brought it into Roman literary culture in the 1st century, with an eloquence and a psychological depth that made him one of the most widely read authors in the ancient world. Epictetus had given it the particular moral urgency of someone who had tested its principles against actual suffering. Marcus knew all of them. He had read them, absorbed them, argued with them in the margins of his thinking. But he was doing something different from all of them. He was not building a system. He was not writing for students or readers. He was applying philosophy to his own life. In real time, under conditions of genuine pressure, and recording the application not for the record, but because the recording itself was part of the practice. Pierre Hadot, the French philosopher and classical scholar whose book, The Inner Citadel, published in French in 1992 and translated into English in 1998, is one of the most important studies of Marcus and his thought. Hadot argued that the Meditations cannot be understood as a work of systematic philosophy and should not be read as one. What Marcus was doing, adotargid, was practicing what the Stoics called spiritual exercises, deliberate acts of attention and reflection designed to reshape the habitual responses of the mind. Writing was the exercise. The content of the writing was the record of the exercise. The point was not the product. The point was the practice. This changes how you read it. If you read the Meditations looking for a consistent philosophical argument, you will be frustrated by its repetitions and its lack of linear development. If you read it as the record of a practice, as someone's honest attempt, day after day and year after year, to become the person they are trying to be, then the repetitions are not failures of structure. They are evidence of the difficulty of the work. Marcus keeps returning to the same themes because the themes keep requiring return. He has not solved patience. He has not achieved equanimity. He is working on them every day, in the dark, by lamplight, in a military tent by the Danube River. The survival of this text across nearly 18 centuries was partly fortunate, but there is also something in the text itself that explains why people kept it, kept copying it, kept reading it across generations that had no political or cultural reason to care about a Roman emperor of the 2nd century. It is honest in a way that is rare. Not the performed honesty of someone who wants to be seen as honest. The actual honesty of someone writing for an audience of one in a private space, about the real difficulty of trying to live according to what you believe. The reader who comes to the Meditations across the centuries finds not a man on a pedestal. They find a man in a room, talking to himself, trying to do better tomorrow than he did today. That is something that does not become obsolete. Chapter 7. The Emperor on Campaign. The Roman military camp was not a romantic place. It was functional in the particular way of institutions designed to keep large numbers of people alive and organized under conditions that were systematically hostile to both. A standard legionary camp of the 2nd century was a rectangle of fortified space, its layout standardized enough that a Roman soldier could find his way around any camp in the empire without being told where anything was. The headquarters building at the centre, the commander's quarters adjacent to it, the barracks in orderly rows, the hospital, the granaries, the workshops, the latrines, positioned carefully relative to the prevailing wind. Marcus Aurelius lived in this world for most of the last 14 years of his life, not visiting it, not inspecting it from a distance and returning to comfortable quarters elsewhere, living in it, in the specific and physical sense of waking up in it every morning and going to sleep in it every night, breathing the particular air of the Danube frontier in all its seasons, which included winters of a severity that Marcus, who had grown up in the Mediterranean climate of Rome, had not spent his first 40 years preparing for. He was not a natural soldier. He had no military training in his background, no instinctive feel for the rhythms of a military campaign that comes from having done it before. What he had was the same quality he brought to everything else, a willingness to learn what he needed to learn, and a seriousness about the responsibilities he had accepted. He had professional commanders for the actual military work, Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus, who became his most trusted general and also his son-in-law when Marcus gave him his daughter Lucilla in marriage, was a man of genuine military ability whose judgment Marcus relied on throughout the campaign years. Pertinax, who would later briefly become emperor himself after Marcus's death, served in significant commands during this period. The legions were led by experienced officers who understood the specific challenges of fighting Germanic and Sarmatian tribes on the Danube frontier in ways that Marcus did not and could not pretend to. Marcus's role was something different. He was the presence that made the whole effort coherent. In a Roman military culture where the emperor's physical presence at the front was a significant factor in the morale and self-understanding of the troops, Marcus's decision to remain in the camps rather than govern the campaign from Rome was not a small thing. It communicated to every soldier on the frontier that the emperor considered what they were doing important enough to share it with them in the most direct possible way. Drawing on what we know of Roman military practice and the scattered evidence of his correspondence and the sources from this period, his days in camp appear to have followed a demanding and unrelenting rhythm. Religious observances marked the beginning of the military day, with Marcus participating in rituals that his role required, even as his philosophical understanding of the divine was considerably more sophisticated than the traditional Roman religious practice he was enacting. Then the business of the morning, meetings with commanders, reports from scouts about tribal movements across the river, dispatches from Rome, because the administrative demands of the empire did not pause because the emperor was on campaign, legal cases, because Marcus continued to hear appeals even in the camps, bringing the same care to individual cases that he had brought in Rome. Then, in whatever time remained, writing. The notebook was the record of a private practice, and the conditions under which he kept it tell you something about how seriously he took that practice. He did not give it up when the circumstances became difficult. He did not decide that the business of ruling and fighting left no room for the interior work. He found the room. He made it in the early hours before the camp woke, or the late hours after it slept, in the brief pauses that a day at the frontier occasionally offered, in whatever time was left after the Empire had taken what the Empire required. He wrote about anger the way someone writes about something they genuinely struggle with, returning to it from multiple angles, trying to understand it well enough to manage it. In a military context, where anger could be useful and where the culture rewarded a certain kind of controlled ferocity, Marcus was working against what the situation might have encouraged, not against effectiveness, against the corruption of character that comes from allowing the role you are playing to reshape who you actually are. He wrote, in a passage that Pierre Hadot considers one of the most revealing in the entire text, that a man should conduct himself so that his principles are those he could at any time explain to the most intelligent person he knows. This is a standard that most people, most of the time, do not meet. It requires a level of self-awareness and a degree of consistency between private thought and public action that is genuinely difficult under ordinary circumstances and becomes more difficult as power increases. Marcus was trying to meet it while fighting a war. The Germanic tribes he was fighting were not a simple enemy. They were multiple distinct peoples, each with their own leadership structures, their own grievances, their own relationships with Rome and with each other. They were a shifting pressure, responding to conditions that Marcus could sometimes influence and sometimes only react to. The wars went through phases, years of active campaigning, years of consolidation, years of renewed crisis. When the situation deteriorated and the whole effort had to begin again, by the middle of the campaign years, Marcus was physically unwell in ways that the ancient sources describe with enough specificity to suggest his health had been genuinely damaged by the conditions he was living in. He had persistent stomach problems. He was managing a body that was not cooperating with the demands being placed on it, using the same discipline he brought to everything else. He did not go home. He wrote, in one of the passages that scholars read as most personally revealing, that the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. These are not the words of someone who has solved the problem of adversity. They are the words of someone who has made a decision in the middle of adversity about how to meet it. He made that decision every morning. Outside the tent, the Danube moved through the dark, carrying the cold down from the mountains, indifferent to the empire on its southern bank, and to the emperor sitting up late with his notebook, trying to figure out how to be worthy of the responsibilities he never asked for and could not put down. The river did not answer him. It never does. But in the asking, in the daily return to the same questions under the same impossible conditions, something was being made that no one on either bank of the Danube that night could have anticipated. A book that would outlast the empire. A voice that would carry nearly 2,000 years, waiting in the dark for someone who needed to hear it. Chapter 8. Faustina, the Marriage History, Misread. She has been dead for nearly 2,000 years, and people are still saying terrible things about her. Annia Galeria Faustina, known to history as Faustina the Younger to distinguish her from her mother, was the wife of Marcus Aurelius for nearly 30 years. She bore him at least 13 children. Though the exact number is uncertain and the sources vary in their accounting, she accompanied him to the Danube frontier during the campaign years, living in conditions that were far removed from the comfort of the imperial palace in Rome. She earned from the troops a nickname that was one of the highest honours a Roman military culture could bestow on a civilian. They called her Mater Castrorum, Mother of the Camps. She died in the winter of 174 or 175 in a small town in Asia Minor called Halala, during a journey she had undertaken to be with Marcus during one of the eastern phases of his campaigns. She was probably in her mid-40s. Marcus was devastated. He asked the Senate to deify her, the Roman mechanism for honouring the dead by placing them among the gods. The Senate agreed. He renamed the town where she died Faustinopolis. In her memory, he established a charitable foundation in her name, the Puellae Faustinianae, which provided support for orphaned girls across the empire. He commissioned portraits and statues. He continued to honour her memory in public ways for the remaining years of his reign. He wrote about her in the Meditations with a simplicity and a warmth that is entirely free of the ambivalence or the qualification that would appear if the marriage had been what her critics claimed it was. He thanked the gods. He wrote, for giving him a wife so obedient, so affectionate, and so artless. This is not the language of a man who believed what was being said about his wife. So what was being said? The accusations against Faustina appear in ancient sources of varying reliability and varying motivation, and they need to be examined with the same critical attention that any responsible reading of ancient history requires. The Historia Augusta, that collection of imperial biographies that is simultaneously one of our most important sources for this period and one of our least reliably accurate, contains a series of allegations against Faustina that are dramatic and specific, and that most modern historians treat with considerable skepticism. The accusations fall into two main categories. The first is sexual infidelity, the claim that Faustina had numerous affairs, including with gladiators and sailors and various other men whose specific identification in the sources tends toward the sensational rather than the credible. The second is political treachery, the claim that Faustina was involved in the revolt of Avidius Cassius in 175, having allegedly corresponded with Cassius and encouraged his rebellion in anticipation of Marcus's death. Neither category of accusation stands up well under serious historical scrutiny. Anthony Birley, in his biography of Marcus, published in 1987 and still considered one of the most authoritative scholarly treatments of the period, examines the accusations against Faustina carefully and finds them largely unconvincing. The sexual allegations, Birley notes, follow a pattern that was extremely common in ancient biographical writing, particularly when the subject was a woman of power and visibility. Accusations of sexual misconduct were the standard rhetorical tool for discrediting women who occupied prominent public positions in the ancient world. The specificity of the allegations does not make them more credible. It makes them more consistent with a literary convention that used vivid detail as a substitute for actual evidence. The political allegations are even more problematic. The claim that Faustina encouraged Cassius's revolt is found primarily in sources written well after the events in question, and that had clear motivations for portraying the reign of Marcus in ways that served later political purposes. The Cassius revolt itself collapsed quickly and left relatively little reliable documentary evidence about its origins. Building a case for Faustina's involvement on this foundation requires accepting a chain of inference that serious historians treat with considerable caution. What does the reliable evidence actually show? It shows a woman who was present, consistently and at considerable personal cost, in the places where Marcus needed to be. The Danube frontier was not a comfortable place for anyone, and for an empress accustomed to the resources of the imperial palace, it represented a genuine sacrifice of comfort and safety. She went anyway. She went repeatedly. The troops who gave her the title Mother of the Camps were not constructing a rhetorical compliment. They were soldiers in difficult conditions who had actually seen her there and who expressed their regard in the most genuine way available to them. It shows a woman who bore at least 13 children in a world where childbirth was genuinely dangerous and repeated childbirth was physically exhausting in ways that modern medicine has largely made it possible to forget. Of those children, only 6 survived to adulthood. Faustina also endured. Repeatedly, the grief of losing children. In a culture that had somewhat different public norms around the expression of parental grief, but that did not render the experience of it any less real. It shows a woman whose husband, one of the most thoughtful and self-aware people who ever lived, wrote about her with uncomplicated affection and gratitude at the end of a life in which he had spent decades thinking carefully about what was actually true and what was merely performed. Marcus was not an easy man to fool. He was not a man given to comfortable illusions about the people close to him. The Meditations are full of clear-eyed observations about human weakness and human self-deception. If his marriage had been what the hostile sources claimed it was, some trace of that discomfort would appear somewhere in his private writing. It does not appear. What appears is gratitude. The gap between the Faustina of the hostile ancient sources and the Faustina of the reliable evidence is large enough to require explanation. Part of the explanation is the literary convention already mentioned, the reflexive use of sexual accusation to discredit prominent women. Part of it may be later political dynamics. Later emperors, or their supporters, having reasons to cast shadows over the reign of Marcus by casting shadows over the woman closest to him. Part of it is the simple operation of a double standard that applied to women of power in the ancient world and that did not disappear when ancient writers put down their pens. Faustina was visible. She was present in public life in ways that went beyond the ceremonial role that most imperial wives occupied. She had the title Augusta. She appeared on coinage. She accompanied her husband to the frontier. She was a figure of real significance in the reign of her husband, not merely a decorative element of it. Visible women in powerful positions attracted a particular kind of hostile attention. The attacks on Faustina need to be understood in that context rather than accepted at face value. This does not mean that Faustina was a figure without complexity. We know relatively little about her inner life, because the sources that might have preserved it were more interested in the accusations than in the person. What we know is what the reliable evidence shows. And what it shows is a woman who was present, who was valued, who was honoured in death with genuine and sustained grief by a man who spent his life trying to see things as they actually were. He named a town after her. He funded orphaned girls in her memory for the rest of his reign. He thanked the gods for her. These are not the actions of a man who had been betrayed. They are the actions of a man who had lost someone he loved. And nearly 2,000 years of gossip, however persistent, does not change what the evidence actually says. Chapter 9. The Sun He Could Not Fix. In the year 161, the same year Marcus became emperor. A boy was born to Marcus Aurelius and Faustina, who would survive childhood and grow to adulthood and eventually inherit the throne of Rome. His name was Lucius Aurelius Commodus. History remembers him as Commodus, and the memory is not kind. He would go on to become one of the more disturbing figures in Roman imperial history, a man who renamed the city of Rome after himself, who fought in the gladiatorial arena in ways that degraded the dignity of the office he held, who executed senators and officials on the basis of suspicion and paranoia, and whose reign ended in assassination in 192, when a conspiracy involving members of his own household decided that the situation had become intolerable. The question that historians have asked ever since, with varying degrees of sympathy and severity, is what Marcus knew, what he saw, and why he made the decision he made. The decision was to name Commodus his heir. To understand why this question is genuinely complicated, you have to place the decision in the world it was made in, rather than judging it from outside, with the benefit of knowing what Commodus eventually became. Marcus was the last of what historians call the 5 good emperors, a sequence of rulers running from Nerva through Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus himself, each of whom had passed power not to a biological son, but to an adopted heir chosen for his qualities. This sequence worked partly because none of those emperors had surviving biological sons to pass power to. The adoption of qualified successors was not an idealistic choice made against the available alternative. It was what the circumstances required. Marcus had a surviving biological son. The Roman world expected an emperor with a surviving biological son to designate that son as his heir. This expectation was not merely sentimental. It was structural. The legitimacy of the succession, in a world where there was no formal mechanism for choosing rulers, rested heavily on the principle of hereditary transmission. An emperor who passed over his own son in favour of someone else was creating a situation of genuine political instability, in which the passed-over son became a focal point for any faction that wanted to challenge the designated successor's authority. Marcus understood all of this. He had spent 19 years managing the machinery of imperial governance. He knew what the constraints were. What did he actually know about Commodus? This is where the evidence requires particular care. The ancient sources, particularly the Historia Augusta and the later historical writing of Cassius Dio, describe Commodus as having shown signs of problematic character from an early age. These accounts need to be read with appropriate skepticism. They were written after Commodus's reign had ended badly and after the Senate had formally condemned his memory. A process called damnatio memoriae, which involved erasing the condemned person's name from public records and retrospectively constructing a narrative of their life that justified the condemnation. Under these conditions, the biographical accounts of Commodus's childhood and youth are likely to have been shaped by the need to explain the outcome rather than by reliable access to what actually happened. Frank McLynn, in his biography of Marcus, published in 2009, argues that the evidence for Marcus having seen clear signs of Commodus's unfitness during the boy's childhood and adolescence is much weaker than the ancient sources suggest. What Marcus could see, McLynn argues, was a boy who was perhaps less intellectually serious than Marcus himself had been, who had different temperamental tendencies, who was being raised in the extremely difficult environment of an imperial court during wartime, surrounded by flatterers and removed from the kind of careful, quiet, philosophically grounded upbringing that had shaped Marcus himself. Marcus made genuine efforts to educate his son. He brought significant teachers to Commodus. He kept the boy close to him during the campaign years, exposing him to the realities of military governance rather than leaving him to the court in Rome. He made Commodus joint emperor in 177, 3 years before his own death, which meant that by the time Marcus died, the succession was already established, and Commodus was already functioning, at least formally, a co-ruler. There is a passage in the Meditations that some scholars read as personally relevant, in which Marcus writes about the pain of watching people you love fail to develop the qualities you hoped they would develop, and about the importance of continuing to treat them with love regardless. Whether this refers to Commodus specifically cannot be established with certainty, but it carries the weight of someone who has been sitting with a specific sadness for a long time and has arrived at the only response available to a Stoic philosopher. You love them anyway. You cannot fix them. You can only do what you have always done. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this: Marcus had available to him the options that actually existed in the Roman world of 177, not the options that a later observer might wish had existed. He had a son who had survived childhood in a family where most children did not, who was physically healthy and of reasonable intelligence, who had been given the best education Marcus could arrange, and who had not, as far as the reliable evidence shows, done anything during his father's lifetime that clearly and unambiguously marked him as the disaster he would become. He also had a Roman political culture that expected him to pass power to that son, a military establishment whose support depended on the predictability of the succession and his own deteriorating health, which gave him limited time to arrange alternatives, even if he had been certain that alternatives were needed. The decision was not made in a vacuum. It was made by a man doing what Marcus always did, working with what was actually in front of him rather than with what he might wish was in front of him. It was also, possibly, a failure of the kind that the most serious and self-aware people are sometimes most vulnerable to, the failure of believing that the values you have spent your life developing can be transmitted to someone else through love and intention and the provision of good teachers, even when the other person is not organized around receiving them. Marcus understood, philosophically, that you cannot control other people. He wrote about this more than about almost anything else. You can only control your own responses, your own character, your own choices. He knew this, and then he watched his son grow up and kept trying anyway. This is not a failure that belongs only to Marcus. It belongs to parenthood itself, to the particular grief of loving someone whose life you cannot live for them. Marcus happened to be living it in a context where the stakes were unusually high, and where the outcome would be visible to all of history. He died in 180, 3 years before Commodus began the phase of his reign that history remembers most harshly. He did not see what Commodus became. What he left behind was not a solved problem. It was a human one, the oldest and most honest kind, the kind that no amount of philosophy fully resolves. He had tried, he had loved, he had let go. The river moves on regardless. Chapter 10. Power without personal scandal. There is a question worth asking before we go any further. When we say that Marcus Aurelius was a good man, what exactly do we mean? Not good in the sense of effective, though the evidence suggests he was that too. Most of the time, and under conditions that would have broken less serious people. Not good in the sense of beloved, though the accounts of how he was regarded by the soldiers on the frontier, the citizens who saw him in the law courts, the Senate that worked with him across nearly 2 decades of his reign. These accounts are consistent enough to be meaningful, good in the harder sense, the sense that has to do with character rather than reputation, with what a person actually is when the audience is not watching, with the gap between what is performed and what is lived. This is a difficult thing to assess across 18 centuries and through sources that had their own reasons for constructing the images they constructed. It requires honesty about what the evidence actually shows and what it does not show, and honesty about the difference between a man who was genuinely good and a man whose goodness was preserved and polished by later generations who needed him to be a certain kind of symbol. Marcus Aurelius was emperor of Rome from 161 to 180, that is 19 years of holding the full authority of the office, not 34, a figure that sometimes circulates in popular accounts and conflates his years as Caesar, as heir apparent under Antoninus, with his years as actual ruler. The distinction matters. The power of a Caesar, however significant, is not the power of the emperor himself. 19 years of absolute power. What did he do with it? The absence of personal corruption in Marcus's reign is striking enough to require examination rather than simple assertion. Roman emperors of this period had access to wealth and resources that are genuinely difficult to imagine in their scale. The history of Rome is substantially the history of what happens when people with that kind of access decide to use it for personal gratification. Caligula had built a floating pleasure palace on a lake in central Italy, a structure of such elaborate luxury that when archaeologists examined what remained in the 20th century, the engineering and ornamentation were still impressive. Nero had built the Domus Aurea, a palace complex so large it incorporated a significant portion of the city of Rome itself. Hadrian had built an enormous villa complex at Tivoli that covered an area larger than many of the cities he governed. Marcus auctioned imperial treasures to pay for a war. This is not a rhetorical contrast. It is a description of an actual documented decision. When the costs of the Marcomannic Wars threatened to exhaust the treasury, Marcus faced a choice between extracting new taxes from provinces already under strain from the plague and the economic disruption of the conflicts, or finding another way. He chose instead to sell objects from the imperial collection, statues, furniture, gold vessels, clothing, items accumulated in the palace over generations. He put them on the auction block in Trajan's Forum. The sources that describe this present it as remarkable. It was remarkable. It was the action of someone who understood, in a concrete and practical way, that the resources he controlled were not his personal property. They were held in trust for the purposes of the office. His personal habits throughout his reign were consistent with the simplicity his mother had taught him as a child. He ate simply. He dressed without ostentation in public contexts where ostentation was the norm. He continued to do things himself that emperors were not expected to do themselves. These habits were not performances. The Meditations, which were never meant to be read by anyone except Marcus himself, describe a man working constantly against the temptations of luxury and comfort, reminding himself of the importance of simplicity, arguing himself back toward austerity when the pull of the available comfort was strong. A man performing simplicity for an audience does not need to remind himself in private to be simple. The private reminders are the evidence that the effort was directed inward rather than outward. He did not use the legal machinery of the empire as a weapon against personal enemies. The pattern of Roman emperors using treason trials to destroy political opponents and confiscate their wealth was one of the most consistent corruptions of imperial power across the 1st and 2nd centuries. Marcus largely avoided it. The clemency he showed after the Cassius revolt, the care he took not to execute Cassius's supporters or use the revolt as a pretext for settling scores, is consistent with a pattern that runs through his entire reign. He was not perfect. The pressures of governing an empire in a state of military emergency produced decisions that cannot all be defended on the grounds of principle alone. The management of populations on the Danube frontier in ways that prioritized Roman strategic interests over the interests of the people being managed. The occasional use of the law in ways that served order rather than strict justice. These are part of the record too, and they belong in the accounting, but the overall shape of his 19 years is distinguishable from the reigns before and after him in ways that the evidence supports. He did not enrich himself. He did not use power systematically to destroy opponents. He did not confuse the resources of the office with his personal property. He held the most powerful position in the Western world, and he did not, as far as the reliable evidence shows, become a different person because of it. This is where the question becomes genuinely interesting. Was this Stoicism in action? Was Marcus, through the daily practice of the philosophical discipline he had maintained since his mid-20s, actually managing to resist the corrupting effects of absolute power in ways that other emperors had not managed? Or was it something else? Pierre Hadot argued that Marcus's philosophical practice was not simply a set of beliefs he held, but a genuine transformation of habitual response, a reshaping of the automatic reactions of the self through sustained daily effort. On this reading, Marcus was not resisting corruption through willpower in any given moment. He had changed, over decades of practice, the way he automatically responded to the temptations that power placed in front of him. The discipline had become, to some degree, natural. But there is another possibility that honesty requires us to consider. The image of Marcus that has come down to us was constructed and preserved in part by people who had reasons to construct and preserve it in a particular way. The Senate that worked with him had reasons to celebrate an emperor who respected senatorial prerogatives. The later philosophical tradition had reasons to celebrate the philosopher-emperor as proof that philosophy could produce good rulers. Historians who wrote about him in the generations after his death were working within interpretive frameworks that shaped what they saw and what they preserved. The Meditations themselves, the most direct evidence we have, show us what Marcus wanted to be, what he was working toward, what standards he was holding himself to. They do not show us every moment of his actual behavior. The gap between aspiration and action is real in every human life. Marcus's life was no exception. What we can say, with the confidence the evidence actually supports, is this. Across 19 years of absolute power, in a political culture where the abuse of that power was the norm rather than the exception, Marcus Aurelius left behind no major record of personal corruption, no pattern of using the office for private enrichment, no systematic use of the legal machinery to destroy opponents, no evidence of the particular transformation that power tends to produce in the people who hold it. Whether this was philosophy in action, or character formed before philosophy arrived, or the careful preservation of an image by people who needed him to be a certain kind of symbol, or some combination of all three, is a question the evidence does not fully resolve. What the evidence does show is the outcome, and the outcome, by the standards of what Roman imperial power tended to produce, was remarkable. Chapter 11. The Paradox He Left Unanswered. This is the chapter that most popular accounts of Marcus Aurelius skip over. It is understandable why they skip it. Marcus Aurelius is one of the most admired figures in Western history, a man whose reputation has survived 18 centuries in essentially the same form. The philosopher, emperor, the good ruler, the man who wrote in private about the importance of treating all human beings with dignity and compassion, and who tried, genuinely and at considerable personal cost, to live according to what he believed. And then there is this. During the reign of Marcus Aurelius, Christian communities across the Roman Empire experienced significant episodes of persecution. People were arrested, tried, tortured, and killed for refusing to participate in the traditional Roman religious practices that the state considered obligatory in the city of Lyons, in what is now southern France. In the year 177, a particularly severe episode resulted in the deaths of a number of Christians, including a slave woman named Blandina, whose courage under torture was recorded in a letter from the Christian community of Lyons that survived and is considered one of the earliest documents of Christian martyrdom. The letter described what had happened in terms that do not lose their force across the distance of nearly 2,000 years. Blandina was subjected to extended torture in the arena. The letter describes her as having given strength to her fellow prisoners through the quality of her endurance. She was eventually killed. Marcus Aurelius was emperor when this happened. He was the man who wrote, in private, that human beings should treat each other with justice and compassion, because all people share in the same rational nature, are part of the same larger whole, and are therefore owed a fundamental regard, regardless of their social position or their particular circumstances. He was the man who wrote that anger at other people for being what they are is senseless, that we are all doing our best with what we have, that the appropriate response to human weakness and human difference is patience and understanding rather than punishment. And during his reign, people were being killed for their beliefs. How do we hold these things together? The honest answer is that it is genuinely difficult, and that the difficulty is not a problem to be resolved by clever argument, but a paradox to be understood as clearly as possible, because understanding it clearly is more valuable than explaining it away. The first thing historical honesty requires is precision about what Marcus's actual role in these persecutions was, because the question of his direct responsibility is more complicated than it might appear. The Roman Empire was not a centralized state in the modern sense. Its administration across vast territories was substantially delegated to provincial governors, who had considerable discretion in how they handled local situations. The legal framework within which Christians were persecuted during this period was not a new law created by Marcus. It drew on existing Roman legal principles and precedents that predated his reign and that treated the refusal to participate in state religious observances as a form of antisocial behaviour that local authorities were empowered to address. The scholar Robin Lane Fox, in his study Pagans and Christians, published in 1986, argues that the persecution under Marcus was largely uncoordinated, driven by provincial initiative rather than central policy, and that there is no reliable evidence of Marcus having issued a general edict ordering the persecution of Christians across the empire. But this does not fully resolve the paradox. Because Marcus was aware of Christians, He mentions them in the Meditations in a passage that is remarkable for its tone. He refers to their readiness to die for their beliefs and describes it, not with admiration, but with a word that translates roughly as mere obstinacy or theatricality. He contrasts it unfavourably with what he considers the proper philosophical approach to death, which in his view should be rational and considered, rather than driven by what he apparently saw as a kind of irrational stubbornness. This passage tells us something important. Marcus had thought about Christians enough to form a view of them. His view was not sympathetic, and within a system that gave provincial governors broad discretion to act against groups considered antisocial or dangerous, a dismissive view from the emperor was not nothing. The deeper paradox is not about the specific question of his direct responsibility for specific acts of persecution. It is about the gap between his philosophical principles and his actual engagement with the people those principles should have led him toward. The Stoic tradition in which Marcus was so deeply formed was, in its foundations, universalist. It held that all human beings share in a common rational nature, that this shared nature is the basis of a genuine human community that transcends the boundaries of city and nation and class, and that the appropriate response to this shared humanity is a form of universal regard, epictetus. The slave, whose writings had changed Marcus's life, was himself living proof that the capacity for philosophical wisdom was not the property of any particular class or status. The Christians being persecuted during Marcus's reign were also expressing a universalist vision, a claim that all people, regardless of status or origin, were equally valued and equally called to a particular form of community and belonging. Marcus did not notice the structural similarity, or if he noticed it, he did not allow it to reshape his response to the people in front of him. He saw obstinacy where another set of eyes might have seen commitment. He saw irrationality where another framework might have recognized a different kind of reason. He saw a threat to the social order where the people being persecuted were simply trying to live according to what they believed, which was precisely what Marcus himself was doing in his own philosophical practice. The philosopher who wrote that we should not be angry at people for being what they are, who wrote that all people share in the same rational nature and deserve the same fundamental regard, did not extend his philosophy to the people dying in the arenas of his provincial cities. Whether he could have is a question that requires honesty about historical constraint. The modern concept of religious freedom, the idea that individuals have a fundamental right to hold and practice their beliefs without interference from the state, was not available to Marcus as a framework. It did not exist in the political vocabulary of his world. This is a real constraint, and it matters. But it does not fully resolve the paradox, because Marcus's philosophical principles, taken seriously, pointed beyond the available political vocabulary of his time. The universalism of his Stoic commitments was not, in principle, limited to the people whose way of life he found congenial. He stopped short. Why he stopped short is a question the historical evidence does not answer clearly. It may have been a failure of imagination, an inability to extend his theoretical commitments to people whose practices and beliefs seemed genuinely alien to him. It may have been a failure of political will, an unwillingness to challenge a legal framework deeply embedded in the world he was governing. It may have been something more troubling, a genuinely limited application of principles he articulated as universal but lived as particular. The historical record does not resolve it. What it leaves us with is a man who is genuinely admirable in many respects and genuinely limited in this one. A limitation that had real consequences for real people who suffered and died under his reign, for reasons that his own philosophical commitments, taken seriously, should have led him to question. This is not a comfortable thing to sit with. It is not meant to be. The purpose of including it here is not to diminish Marcus or to replace one incomplete picture with another. It is to insist on the full picture, because the full picture is more honest and ultimately more useful than the simplified version. A man who was entirely good, who applied his principles perfectly and consistently in every direction, who never fell short of what his own philosophy demanded, would be a saint or a fiction. He would also be considerably less interesting than the man Marcus actually was, and considerably less useful as a mirror for thinking about our own lives and our own limitations. Marcus was a man of genuine philosophical seriousness and genuine moral limitation, living in a world that constrained what he could see and what he could do, trying with considerable effort and partial success to be the person he was trying to be. The people who died in Lyons in 177 were real. Their deaths belong in the accounting of his reign. And the man who could write, in private, about the importance of treating all human beings with dignity, who governed an empire with a degree of personal integrity that was remarkable by any reasonable standard, and who presided over the deaths of people for their beliefs without finding a way to stop it. This man is more human and more recognizable, and ultimately more worth understanding than either his admirers or his critics have always made him. He left this paradox unanswered. It is still unanswered. Perhaps that is the most honest thing we can say about it. Chapter 12. The Last Winter. By the winter of 179. Marcus Aurelius was a man whose body had been trying to tell him something for years. The stomach problems that had troubled him since at least the middle of his reign had become more severe and more persistent. He was eating very little, not as a philosophical gesture, but because eating had become genuinely difficult. He was sleeping poorly. The physical stamina that had carried him through nearly a decade and a half of frontier campaigning, through the cold winters of the Danube and the unrelenting demands of running an empire from a military tent, was diminishing in ways that the discipline of his philosophical practice could not reverse. He was 58 years old. In the ancient world, 58 was not young, and 58 years of the kind of life Marcus had lived. The stress of continuous military campaigning, the chronic health problems, the unrelenting administrative demands, the grief of children lost in childhood, and a wife lost on a distant road in Asia Minor. 58 years of all of that had produced a man who was, by all the evidence, genuinely worn out. He was still working. The documents from the final years of his reign show no retreat from engagement, no handing off of responsibilities to subordinates, while the emperor withdrew into comfortable decline. He was still making decisions, still corresponding, still hearing cases, still present in the life of the empire he had been responsible for since 161. Commodus had been made co-emperor in 177, and was nominally sharing the authority, but the evidence suggests Marcus remained the actual centre of governance for as long as he was capable of being. He returned to the Danube frontier for what would be his final campaign in 178. The practical reasons for his being there were real. The situation on the frontier had not fully stabilized. There were ongoing negotiations with tribal leaders, ongoing management of populations that had been absorbed into or pushed against the Roman border. Ongoing military pressure that required the kind of authoritative presence that Marcus had provided throughout the campaign years. But there may have been something else too. Marcus had spent the better part of the last 14 years on the Danube. The frontier had become, in some sense, that the evidence allows us to sense without fully articulating, his world, in a way that Rome was no longer quite his world. The camps, the river, the particular quality of the northern light, the soldiers who had become familiar presences across years of shared difficult conditions. These were the context in which the most important internal work of his life had been done. The Meditations had been written here. The philosophical practice that had sustained him through everything had been maintained here, in conditions that tested it more severely than any comfortable study ever could have. He went back. He was based near a settlement that ancient sources call Vindobona, which corresponds to the location of what is now the city of Vienna in Austria, though some ancient accounts place his final days near Sirmium, further east along the Danube, and the precise location cannot be established with complete certainty from the surviving evidence. This ambiguity is worth acknowledging rather than papering over with a confident assertion the sources do not quite support. The winter of 179 into 180 was his last. What happened in the final weeks and days of his life is known to us primarily through ancient sources whose reliability varies and whose accounts do not entirely agree with each other. The Historia Augusta, which provides the most detailed narrative of his death, is a source that requires careful handling. Some of what it records carries the ring of genuine tradition. Other details reflect the kind of elaboration that ancient biographical writing regularly added to important deaths, shaping the ending of a life into a form that literary and philosophical expectations required. With that caveat clearly stated, here is what the tradition records. Marcus knew he was dying, not in the vague sense in which all of us know we are mortal, but in the specific sense of a man whose body had been telling him for months that the end was approaching, and who had, by the evidence of everything else we know about him, been honest enough with himself to hear what his body was saying. He appears to have responded to this knowledge in the way that the Stoic tradition had prepared him to respond, not with denial, not with desperate attempts to extend what was ending, but with a considered acceptance that the ancient sources present as consistent with his philosophical character. The ancient sources record that in his final days Marcus reduced his eating and his drinking to the point where some observers interpreted it as a deliberate hastening of his death. Whether this was a conscious philosophical act, an embodiment of the Stoic teaching that a wise person can choose the moment of their departure when the conditions of life have become incompatible with living well, or whether it was simply the natural diminishment of appetite that accompanies serious illness in its final stages, is something we cannot determine with certainty across the distance of nearly 2,000 years. What we can say is that the tradition preserved this detail as meaningful and as consistent with the character of the man it was describing. He called Commodus to him. What passed between them in those final days is not recorded in any source that historians consider reliable in its specifics. The Historia Augusta provides dialogue, but ancient biographical writing regularly supplied deathbed speeches and final conversations that served the literary and moral purposes of the narrative rather than recording what was actually said. We cannot know what Marcus said to his son in those last meetings, whether he gave advice, expressed hope, acknowledged fear, or simply sat in the particular silence of a dying man with someone he loved and could not fix. The ancient sources record that he asked those gathered around him why they were weeping for him, rather than thinking about death, which was the common fate of all of them. Whether these exact words were spoken in precisely this form is not certain. The sentiment is consistent with a man who had spent decades writing about the universality of death and the irrationality of treating it as a catastrophe rather than a natural conclusion. He died on the 17th of March in the year 180. He was 58 years old. He had been emperor for 19 years. He had been carrying the weight of the office across plagues and wars and rebellions and the loss of people he loved and the slow erosion of a body that had been asked to do more than bodies are generally designed to sustain. The reaction of the soldiers when the news spread through the camp was recorded by ancient sources in terms that suggest genuine grief rather than performed mourning. These were men who had served with him, who had seen him in the camps year after year, who had watched him share their conditions without the insulation of the comfort his office entitled him to. Their grief reflects a relationship between an emperor and his troops built on actual presence and actual shared experience rather than ceremonial distance. Commodus was with the army when his father died. He arranged for the body to be transported back to Rome with appropriate military honours. Marcus was deified by the Senate, as the Roman mechanism of honouring the dead required of an emperor whose reign was being assessed as successful. Temples were dedicated to him. The cult that developed around his memory was, by the accounts that survive, genuinely felt in certain parts of the empire, particularly among the military communities of the frontier, where he had spent so much of his reign. He was buried eventually in the mausoleum of Hadrian, the great circular tomb on the bank of the Tiber in Rome that had become the burial place of the Antonine emperors. The structure still stands, now called the Castel Sant'Angelo. Its original purpose transformed across centuries of subsequent use into something Hadrian and Marcus would not recognize. The Rome around it has changed beyond any recognition that would be possible for someone from the 2nd century. The empire it was built at the center of is gone. And yet, his notebook survived, not because anyone in 180 understood what it was or recognized that it was going to matter, not because it was officially preserved or formally transmitted as an important document, because it existed, and because the people who came across it in the years and decades and centuries after his death found in it something that could not be put down and could not be forgotten, something that kept demanding to be copied and kept and passed forward. A man writing to himself in a tent by a river, trying to figure out how to be good in conditions that made goodness difficult. It turned out that this was something people needed to read. It turned out that this was something that did not become obsolete. The world he wrote in is gone. The questions he was asking are not. And on the night he died, somewhere near the Danube, in a camp that has long since returned to earth. The river kept moving, the same river that had been there before Rome and would be there after it, the same river he had looked at from the bank across 14 years of campaigning, the river that flows quietly through the background of some of the most honest writing any human being has ever committed to a page. It did not pause for him. He would not have expected it to. He had written, after all, that everything passes, that emperors and empires and all the drama of human ambition dissolve into the same indifferent stream of time, that the only thing worth attending to is the quality of your own life in the present moment you actually occupy. He had written it to himself. on a cold night, in a tent, by a river, and then the river moved on. Chapter 13. Why he still speaks. Begin with a question. Why would anyone in the 21st century reach for a notebook written by a Roman emperor nearly 2,000 years ago? Not for historical interest, not because they are studying the ancient world or writing a paper on Stoic philosophy, but because something is hard, and they need someone who has been there, and the tent by the river turns out to be closer than it looks. Some modern accounts have associated the experience of long political imprisonment with the Stoic tradition that Marcus represented, suggesting that the kind of philosophy he practiced, the daily effort to keep the self intact when everything outside is pressing against it, has spoken to people facing the specific difficulty of confinement and loss, and the forced waiting that other people's power imposes on your life. Whether those connections run directly through the Meditations or through the broader tradition Stoicism represents, the orientation is the same. The quality of a life is determined not by its circumstances, but by the character of the person living it. And character is something that circumstance cannot reach unless you let it. This is the argument of the Meditations, not made once, in a clear and finished form, but made every day, in the dark, in a tent, by a man who had to keep making it, because keeping it was the practice, and the practice was the point. The survival of the Meditations across nearly 18 centuries is itself a kind of argument about what the text contains. It was copied by monks who found in its moral seriousness something compatible with their own commitments. It was preserved by Byzantine scholars through the long centuries when much of the ancient world's writing was being lost. It was translated into Latin in the 16th century and began its modern life as a widely circulated text. It has been in continuous print in various languages for hundreds of years and is, by most measures of such things, more widely read now than at any previous point in its existence. Why? Part of the answer is historical. Marcus Aurelius is a genuinely significant historical figure, and the Meditations are a genuinely important document of ancient thought. These facts alone would justify the text's presence in libraries and on course syllabi and in the footnotes of scholarly books. But historical significance does not explain why people read it late at night in difficult periods of their lives. What explains that is something else. The Meditations speak in the first person, which sounds obvious but is not. They are not addressed to an audience. They are not pitched at a reader. They are one person talking to themselves, with the particular honesty that is only possible when there is no audience to perform for, working through the real difficulty of trying to live according to what they believe. When a reader encounters this, the effect is not the effect of reading an argument or a lecture. It is the effect of overhearing someone's actual thought, which is intimate and direct in a way that addressed writing rarely manages. And the thought, the actual content of what Marcus was working through, turns out to be recognizable across the full distance of the centuries between him and anyone reading him today. You will meet difficult people today. You will be tempted to react with anger rather than understanding. You will be tempted to care too much about what other people think of you and not enough about what you actually are. You will be pulled toward comfort when discipline is what the situation requires. You will be distracted by things that do not matter from the things that do. You will find it hard to be fully present in the moment you are actually in, rather than the moment you are anticipating or the moment you are still carrying from yesterday. Marcus was writing about this. Specifically, honestly, without decoration, for an audience of one, and that audience of one turns out to have been, without knowing it, everyone who ever picked up the book and found themselves in it. The influence of the Meditations on specific individuals who have faced serious tests is documented well enough to be more than anecdote. Bill Clinton has spoken publicly about reading Marcus Aurelius and finding, in the Stoic, emphasis on doing the right thing regardless of political consequence, something he returned to during the most difficult periods of his presidency. James Mattis, military leader and former Secretary of Defense, has described carrying a personal copy of the Meditations through multiple military deployments, finding in Marcus's combination of philosophical seriousness and practical military responsibility something directly applicable to his own situation. These are not people who share a culture or a political position or a professional background. What they share is the experience of having been tested in ways that required something more than cleverness or willpower, something more like a fundamental orientation toward what matters and what does not, toward what is in your control and what is not, toward the question of who you are when the circumstances are genuinely difficult. Marcus had written about exactly that, from exactly that situation, and this is the final thing worth understanding before the night is over. Marcus Aurelius did not set out to matter to anyone beyond himself. The Meditations were not written for posterity. They were not written to be remembered or quoted or read in the dark by people nearly 2,000 years later who were trying to figure out how to carry their own particular version of the weight he was carrying. He was just writing to himself, trying to stay honest, trying to stay good, and somehow, in that entirely private and entirely human effort, he left behind something that people keep reaching for when the weight gets heavy and the night gets quiet and the question of how to carry it becomes urgent enough to make you look for someone who has been there before. He has been there. He is in the book. And the book, as it turns out, was always waiting for exactly this moment, for a quiet room, for someone willing to listen. For you, there is a tent by a river in the dark of a winter nearly 2,000 years ago. The fire has burned low. The camp is quiet. The river moves. The emperor who hated power and carried it anyway is sitting with his notebook, writing to himself for no audience and every audience, asking the question he never stopped asking. How do I stay good? He asks it again tonight, in the pages of a book that was never meant to exist, in a voice that was never meant to carry this far, asking you the same question he asked himself, every morning until the last one. Sleep well